And we are back. Well, we've had some really spooky stories tonight, and now it's time for that treat I promised you earlier. Our own Brett McCluskey will be playing a piece that Brett recently composed. But before he does, Brett, could you tell us something about the piece?
Sure. Up until about 2:30 this afternoon, this piece was made for flute and piano. Unforeseen circumstances has made me rename this piece. This is called a New Album Leaf for 2 pianos. One piano will be mechanical, which I recorded earlier, and one will be a little bit live of me. And the reason why I called it New Album Leaf is because things are changing. There's a lot of leaves falling down, and also I think of a scrapbook. It's a melodic scrapbook where I can put this piece in there and maybe one day listen to it again and remember the time that I had where I live now in Jonesborough and the way I feel. So and one day I'll be able to, anyway, hope you enjoy it.
exquisite. It really was. Fall leaves on a beautiful fall day coming down. That was a treat. Let's give them another round of applause.
Hey, Lori.
Yes, Chelsea?
What is a vampire's favorite candy?
Okay, I'll bite, Chelsea. What's a vampire's favorite candy?
A sucker! Hey, Lori.
Yes, Lucy?
What monster loves to dance?
I really don't know, Lucy. What monster loves to dance?
The boogeyman.
Okay, I think the kids are trying to tell me it's time to get back to some more spooky stories. You know, it's a good thing this region is full of them.
Years and years ago, before automobiles were commonplace, a person still had to dodge horse manure walking down Main Street. An old man would visit this town. He always had a bucket perched upside down on his left shoulder. This man's true name has been since lost to time, but everyone knew him as Old Buckethead. He'd bring his old nag, Laverne, to Main Street to haul back enough groceries to last a month. Old Buckethead was never known to take a wife or to have family, and he lived a very solitary life down in his holler. No one in town really knew him, but they all anticipated his arrival each month, as sure as they counted on the full moon. Each autumn, we children could count on hearing this story again from my grandfathers. He always started it the same. It was mid-October.
It was mid-October on a cool Saturday morning with the previous night's fog finally burning away. The street was already busy as people went about their trading and gossiping. Old Buckethead moseyed up the street with his old horse, Laverne. He was not a pleasant-looking man, with a half-grown beard, hot-front face, and scrappy teeth spaced out like tombstones in an old cemetery. His arrival always created a small stir in the community. They were afraid of him, though he gave no reason for them to be that way, except that he looked different, and he was a bit grumbly. Like the wild tidings that sometimes accompany a full moon, Old Buckethead's arrival ignited a similar dread.
Look, it's Old Buckethead.
Johnny just told me that Old Buckethead is down by the library, and he's heading this way.
Oh no, I'm going to go the opposite direction. It gives me a fright when he makes eye contact with me.
Mommy, that man scares me. Here comes Old Buckethead. Let's go the other way.
Here he comes.
I think it's time to finish our shopping and leave now.
As you could tell, Old Buckethead did not have any friends. He might even say he preferred it that way. Most folks were scared of him, but some were just outright mean.
Hey, Old Buckethead, scare any babies today?
Let me be now.
Why do you wear that bucket, Buckethead? You hiding something? Why are you so mean, Buckethead?
Let me be.
And that was the question. Why do you wear that bucket, Buckethead? No one knew. Was he hiding something? Was it money? Some kind of treasure? There were even rumors that he kept a pet bat or possum in there, shielding it from the daylight. The fact was, no one knew. This piqued the curiosity of three boys here in town. These boys were not shining examples of do-goodery. They were actually known to cause a fair amount of trouble. Ted, Joe, and William, champions of cow tipping, egg throwing, and chicken thieving. Not in school by choice and not quite old enough for jail by law. Ted, Joe, and William were playing marbles and heard Old Buckethead growling up the street. They stopped their game and started following him, wondering out loud what was underneath that bucket.
I bet he's got some kind of animal up there that crawls out at night. Dang, what if it's a spider or something?
Ted, that's stupid. Any animal couldn't live up there.
I didn't say live, Joe. Maybe it's just sleeping.
I think it's money. I'm willing to bet on it.
Will, what makes you so sure of that?
Watch him at his next stop. See where he gets his money.
Ted, Joe, and William followed old Buckethead, staying back several paces as not to draw suspicion. They watched closely as he stopped at the general store. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, counting them to the cashier. When he went through those bills and realized he did not have enough money, he growled again and quickly reached up to the bucket, slipped his fingers quickly inside, and pulled out another stack of bills.
See, I told you. That's where he keeps his money.
Watching all of this, William devised a plan. The boys knew the vicinity of where old Buckethead lived. A dirt road went up into a holler about a mile away from town. That was about as far as anyone went towards old Buckethead's cabin. People were generally too afraid to follow him, and if someone were to tempt fate by doing so, old Buckethead was not too shy with his old shotgun, or so the townsfolk had told each other anyway. Ted, the more squirrely of the three, had to be talked into going up that dirt road, but promises of treasure helped entice him. They waited until after dark, using the light of the full moon to help them find their way. They followed the dirt road and then had to scour the side of the mountain for a long time until Joe caught the glimmer of candlelight through a window. Then, as if someone was watching over them, clouds obscured the moonlight so they could not be seen. They quickly but quietly stepped up to the window. Will, being the tallest, got the first look. The dying flames in the fireplace inside gave the room an eerie orange glow and caused shadows to dance over the walls.
Look, an old Buckethead lying there in a cot next to the wall. His mouth's wide open, showing his big tombstone maw.
Oh my gosh.
Now keep it down. You want to wake the old man up? Let's find a way in quietly.
The three boys snuck in through the open window and tiptoed over to where old Buckethead was sleeping.
Now go ahead. Take that bucket off his shoulder so we can grab the loot and run.
Me? Why does it have to be me? It was your idea. You do it.
To heck with both of you chickens. I'll do it, but I'll get more treasure.
Deal.
Joe stepped forward but cringed when a floorboard creaked. An old Buckethead snorted loudly but did not wake up. Joe exhaled before moving forward again. Ever so slowly, he placed his hands around the bucket, readying himself to pull up. His flayed-up fingers on the bucket. He inhaled and quickly lifted the bucket up.
Ah! What are you doing? Get out of here!
What they saw under that bucket when it was removed was not treasure. It was not money. It was not a bat or possum. It was another head. Old Buckethead's brother, or at least that's what the townsfolk would later call him, or it. As Joe lifted the bucket, this other head was awakened, his eyes rolling around like billiard balls in their sockets, his three-toothed mouth screaming in surprise. He woke up Buckethead, and they started screaming in unison. Ted, being the squirrely one, got out quicker than that jackrabbit with his tail on fire, running and tripping, falling and crawling all the way back down the mountain. Will and Joe were too surprised and scared to run, and old Buckethead and his brother could move pretty quickly for an old man, or old men. Ted ran to the first house he saw and told his story.
He arrived at our house, pale as a ghost. We all ran out and alerted the neighbors and the law. At the first sign of light, a group of men from town and the law leading the way headed up to the old dirt road, finally finding that cabin as the sun crested the hilltops. I kept the poor boy until his parents came.
Meanwhile, the men reached old Buckethead's house. They knocked the door down, holding shotguns with hound dogs ready to go. But there was no one there. The fire in the fireplace had burned itself out. A few coins were on the floor next to the old cot. Underneath the bed was an old bucket on its side. The owner and occupant of that bucket was nowhere to be found. Neither was William or Joe. The townsfolk talked about this for years, but Ted never did. In fact, he rarely said anything from then on. He became known for a streak of silver white hair that went across his right temple, but happened to appear on the night he ran away.
Now, in our day, after all these years, that old dirt road has become overgrown, the woods taking it over for its own. If a person persists, they could possibly come across old Buckethead's cabin on the other side of that ridge. It's probably covered in moss and decay by now. If you do, by chance, run across that cabin on a full moon night, it's quite possible that you may find an old rusty bucket, a little larger than a man's head. Out of respect, just leave it there, and hopefully, that's all you will find.
I'll leave it there. Yeah. In fact, I won't even go looking for it.
Sometimes you find things when you're not even looking, especially in a town as old as this. If you walk through the old cemetery, the names and their stories sometimes come to life. Brush away the leaves and see the names on the stones. Listen closely and you can hear their stories. Who is this? Martha Bailey?
For my husband, the train was opportunity. It was a way out. Jacob and I live here in Jonesborough, but there was a whole world out there that he wanted to see. The train was a chance to make something with his own two hands, to make a mark. That's what he told me when he had to leave. Martha, I'm bringing in the future. I looked at our 3 kids and I thought, I am too. But Jacob didn't see it that way. Jacob didn't want to mold flesh, he wanted to mold iron. He let the Southern line take him to Alabama and beyond. I stayed here. We had a life in Jonesborough, and not all of us could just up and move. The money was decent, and I know Jacob was working hard trying to make a living. I just wish he was closer all those years. He'd come back from time to time to visit and check on the kids, on me. But the rail was his real home. He didn't say it, but I could tell. It was like the house just wasn't sitting right with him. The 4 walls just wasn't resting easily. He told me, Martha, out there I'm a man just like any other man, doing the work. A lot of men try, but a lot of men quit. But I always come back. And he did. I'd wash some clothes. He'd repack his suitcase. He'd kiss the kids. Kiss me. He was gone again. As long as there was a line that needed to be repaired, a track that needed line, he was there. The train was a very tempting mistress.
From the Herald and Tribune, November 20th, 1895. Jacob Bailey, a well-known colored man whose home was in this place, but who had been railroading in Alabama, was killed in a wreck on the Alabama Division of the Southern. His remains were sent here for burial, but so badly was he mashed up that he was almost beyond recognition. There were 4 others killed at the same time.
The train took my husband away from me. The a changed man. And the train brought my husband back, a changed man once more.
Thank you, Kay, for that voice from the past. You can see stories like this come to life every autumn in Jonesborough's historic cemetery as the real-life history play A Spot on the Hill by Angie Fellers Mason is performed. It's become a new tradition here. Now, talking about traditions, Jonesborough Storytellers Guild has been telling stories here in Jonesborough every Tuesday night for over 20 years. Linda Poland is their queen of the scary stories. Linda, would you come up here and share one of those scary stories with us?
I'd be delighted. It was almost 40 years ago when my husband Jim and I were walking down Main Street, and we saw a tall man with a fedora hat on, and he was carrying the strangest looking chair. He had a deep voice and a rich laugh. His name was Dr. George Byrd, and that was my first encounter with the man. He and Jim talked about a hunting dinner that they would do at Byrd's kitchen, and it was done for years and years and years. It was all wild game in the beginning. Later on, things changed a little bit, became more convenient, as the men didn't go hunting for their food. Doc Byrd was one of my true mentors when I came to work for the town of Jonesborough to develop a tour program. And he would take me aside and tell me different stories and different things. I used to love to sit down with Doc Byrd and his wife at their home and listen to the different stories about how Sisters Row was built and how the stones were brought in from the rock quarry and why it was called Sisters Row and all kinds of things. But sometimes they would talk over each other. And sometimes she'd look over at him and say, "Shh, be quiet, George, I'm talking." Other times they would actually get downright mad at each other. And I would wish I could back out the door. Well, Dr. George Byrd came by my office one day and he said, "Let's go for a walk about town." I loved these because I always knew I was going to be given some rich nuggets. And so we would walk around town, and some of y'all know that sound when the wind comes from a certain direction and it whistles through that weather vane up on the Baptist church, swoops down and goes through and whistles through the rooftops of Jonesborough, making a whining sound. Well, Dr. Byrd and I were walking down the street, and the wind was picking up and it was getting pretty chilly. It really was. And the sun seemed to be plummeting down out of the sky, and before we knew it, it was getting darker and darker. As we walked, we suddenly found ourselves in front of Byrd's kitchen. I always loved to go into Byrd's kitchen, and let me tell you something, it was not in the Byrd's house. No, it was in Sisters Row, down in the basement. And in the summertime, the stones kept that room cool as you could ever want it. And in the wintertime, it absorbed the heat of the fires that were built in there. And when we walked in, I could smell cider and cinnamon. And smelling that cider and cinnamon usually meant that we were going to sit a while. I never looked at my watch because I didn't want to get antsy. I never knew how long we would be there. And there weren't cell phones back then to say, "I'm going to be late, I'm with Doc Byrd." So we would just sit. And this is a story that he shared with me, and I still use it on the lanterns and legends and whispers and mysteries tours that I do down through the streets of Jonesborough. I sat there and he mesmerized me. The story is much too long, so I had to rework it. It got to be more and more were coming, from magazines and newspapers, wanting stories, wanting to visit the haunted buildings. Somehow they were referred to me, I guess because I'd lived here just about longer than anyone else. Did I always tell you that I was named the oldest practicing dentist in the state of Tennessee? He grinned at me. Well, no matter, has nothing to do with the story. Anywhere, there was 3 of them, and they were hot on the trail of a story they had heard about Jonesborough. We visited around the town, and I was hoping that they might hear that whistling through the rooftops, but it wasn't given as a gift to them. We went around and out towards the cemetery, of course, and I told them all about the bathhouses and the shadows that appeared sometimes. But that's in another story. Finally, we went to the house that was supposed to be having some strange happenings and strange noises. Kind of a tap, tap, tapping sound and low guttural growls. He looked at me and said with a great big grin again, I'd be wanting to know where those guttural growls were coming from, wouldn't you? Me and them 3 ghost hunters sat at the kitchen table, and they talked out what they were going to do, what they needed, and how they were going to do it. They needed access to the upstairs and complete quiet. And they needed a place to write exactly what they saw when they came down. They said they always went one at a time into whatever space was going to be investigated. Then, when they came back, they wouldn't speak to each other. They wouldn't share what they had seen. They would write it down and share it later. Every one of them had done this type of investigation. And after it was finished, they would all come and sit down. And that's when the ones that were there, that owned the house, and me, would get to hear what was making that guttural growling. A card table was set up and a pot of coffee was put on. Doc Byrd said he was kind of snickering to himself that such a big deal was being made out of this whole thing. One of the gals went up first, he said. It was so quiet, we could hear every step she took. Then the creaking of the floor, slow footsteps, then a sound of a lot of things hitting the floor, running, and she came back to us looking like a ghost herself. She started to speak, but the other girl covered her mouth and reminded her, no, we all have to see what it is. The poor girl that had just come down was shivering, so the man took off his coat. The man ghost hunter. And they took her and set her at the table and gave her her writing materials that she had brought herself. But she left the table and she went over and she cowered kind of in the corner. And she was almost like she didn't want anybody to see what she was doing. She began to write and then she ripped that page out and she threw it away and she began to draw something on that. The man, ghost hunter man, started to go up, but the other gal said she was going next. She pulled out the biggest torchlight I had ever seen. It must have taken 12D batteries or something to fill it up. She looked at the one shivering in the corner and licked her lips and started up the steps. She seemed to bound up those steps like she wanted to get it over with. The creaking of the floor made us all look up at the ceiling as if we could see through it or something. We watched her steps or listened to them as they went across. She had made it farther into this space than the other gal had when suddenly we heard something else walking. No, I don't know what it was. It was more than 2 feet. It was something on all fours, making tapping sounds. And then we heard something else. It sounded more like claws being pulled across the floor. Ah! That was the scream that came down. And all of a sudden there was a lot of muffled noise. And I don't even think that girl hit the steps when she came down. She rolled into that room. And she just didn't know what to say. We gave her paper too, because she was going, paper, paper, paper. We handed her the paper. We were all getting a bit tense. She secluded herself and the man was left standing in the middle of the room. I felt like they should have tried to talk him out of doing any more. But the man said they had made a pact, and he'd seen those two worse than they were then. The man asked about the big torchlight, and the girl said, I threw it at it. The man slowly crept up the stairs. His footsteps were heavier on the ceiling. Slowly, then, as he almost got to the other end, a heavy thud on the floor, then the tapping of the toenails, screaming, things crashing to the floor. There it was, the guttural growling. It seemed like it came from deep within something. A crash against the wall again, something heavy thrown, then the man running down the stairs. Doc Byrd said the other man in the house had already reached for his rifle off the wall over the hearth.